For the second time in 2 months, the Ku Klux Klan came to Columbus.
You're probably familiar with the shooting of Walter Scott.
Exclusive cell phone video, hear gunshots. They are about 50 feet away from Michael Brown,
15 bullet wounds for no reason whatsoever.
showing a white Chicago police officer shooting a black teenager 16 times.
How could you not be here today? This is a human issue. It's about the people. It's about doing what's right. It's about finding truth. It's about ending white supremacy. It's about all of us. It's about standing what the United States is supposed to represent.
Hi, and welcome to East Hampton's newest television show, Check Your Bias. Today, we're going to talk about racism, how it affects us locally, and where we can look for it. We're hoping that this project is a dialogue that will start conversations in your homes and get us as a community talking about a very relevant topic that affects us all. So today, my guests are George Claxton.
Good morning.
George was formerly a reporter for the Greenfield Recorder and do your own bio.
I also worked for the Detroit Free Press and the American Association for the Advancement of Science as a science reporter, and I have written also for the New York Times.
And last time I checked, you're African American and have been that way your whole life, correct?
Well, let me check. Yes, I am.
It was really funny because I was talking to some other friends about potentially participating in this project. You know, they were like, "Well, you know, I'm no expert," but that was a common expression. Was, "Well, I'm not an expert on racism, but I have been black for 44 years, so I think I could say a few things."
And I'm an old guy, so I still think of myself as being black. I've gone through the period when we were colored, when we were Negroes, and when we were black, and frankly, as far as I know, nobody from my family has been in Africa for 300 years, so.
Jan like that. And our second guest, Mr. Jan Norman, guidance counselor extraordinaire and someone who has devoted their life to reaching out to young people. Mm-hmm. So welcome.
Thank you.
Is there any other bio stuff you want to add?
No, I mean, I chuckled at what George said, because my father, who was a much older guy, stated he remembers when he was also a Negro and colored.
Oh, I remember that too.
And black. And one of my younger brothers or sisters were saying, "But Dad, it's African American now." He says, "Well, nah, I'm sticking with black." So, and that's where he was, that's how he identified, and that's where I am as well.
Well, I think that that's actually, it's funny that you guys were telling these stories, because I think that maybe is, we were going to open with a different subject, but since we're already talking about it, the naming of things. And I think it becomes confusing, and then sort of the backlash with political correctness is sort of, you know, in one period of time this is appropriate, in another period of time it's completely inappropriate. In one period of time, another term will be appropriate, and then 20 years later that term is completely inappropriate. So what is appropriate? And how do we help people navigate that social water of what's appropriate and what's not?
Well, for me, I think, first of all, you know, it comes down to respecting, you know, people and how they identify. You know, no matter who they are, you know, black, transgender, whatever, it's respecting that person and how they identify, and that's basically who they are. You know, if I identify as black, my experience, you know, from my personal experience, from, you know, what I got from my parents and beyond, that makes me who I am.
You know, it's interesting that you said what you did about political correctness a moment ago. Neil Gaiman, the famous author, said, replace the phrase political correctness with showing respect for other people. So all the people who say, well, I'm sick of all this political correctness, what they're actually saying is they're sick of showing respect for other people. Mm-hmm. I remember when I was a kid and teachers would call us nigger in school, and stupid nigger. in school. I remember when that word could be heard on television and in movies, in plays. Well, you can still hear it in plays, but you're not going to hear it on television anymore. People would call you that on the street. And it's one of those things where it was never actually an appropriate word. It was a way of attacking people. And it's always been used that way. You know, we have this discussion now about the phrase redskin. And you have people coming up with all sorts of bizarre stories as to where the term came from. It was never intended to be a respectful term. It was always meant to be an insult.
I'm just trying to think of, I'm picturing the colonial boardroom where someone said, you know what, let's go with redskin. But it doesn't really work like that.
No.
No. And I would just piggyback off what George was saying. All those words are meant to demean. And when people are allowed to do that, it runs rampant. Not only is it, you mentioned the media, TV, hearing this word pretty frequently. It begins to, some people say it's okay. And then it makes it as a way of being okay to demean a certain group or groups. And that's the piece where I think when we come to define who we are, that's where we're putting this message out that, be proud of who you are, because the word nigger, and I know some people state that, if you use it enough, or you become, you own the word, or you make it not matter. Now that word still is, from where it came as well, a way to demean and dehumanize another individual and a group of people. Had a profound impact on people. So, it's never, as you stated, it was never any of those words or terms never meant to be something that was positive, only to dehumanize.
I would have to say, if I look back in my own personal history as a person who is not white, all of those kind of paraphrasing, naming words were never meant to be respectful on any level. So rather than go through the litany of what I've been called in my lifetime ethnically, I would just, agree and validate. And when we do consider that in our personal lives, for the folks that are out watching, is think about if what you're about to say is not respectful, perhaps you should rethink what you're about to say, even if you're angry, and especially if you're angry, because we do tend to let our emotions get the better of us. And in that way, I think it's really interesting because, Western Massachusetts, we do have racial diversity in Western Massachusetts. We have some cultural diversity in Western Massachusetts. But overall, it's still a pretty white area. It's very white-centric. And we have this thing that I learned about 25 years ago called white privilege. But I think that only now is that sort of coming up as a topic for national discussion. And I thought maybe a service that we could provide would be to talk about what white privilege is from the other side of the coin. Okay.
Even going back to the naming of names, what you're called, what you're recognized as. There are people who prefer being called African American, and this has set people off on the political right who are now angry that people are calling themselves African American. Oh, we're all just Americans. I remember a time when people denied Americanness to black people, to people of Asian ancestry, even to people of Irish ancestry. We weren't Americans. And in fact, there's even a Supreme Court finding, Supreme Court Justice from Tennessee, Roger Taney, the a Dred Scott decision in which he determined that black people could be citizens of a state but could never be citizens of the United States. And specifically said in that finding that black people had no rights that any white person needed to pay attention to. We were considered non-human in much of the United States. What we now refer to as the Confederacy, which was basically the South and the southwestern the United States, or at least parts of the Southwest, at least as far as Texas. And we, when we were discussing doing this show, we're talking about things like the use of the battle standard of Northern Virginia that most people refer to as the Stars and Bars flag, which actually isn't the Stars and Bars flag, by the way. The Stars and Bars flag is slightly different. They changed it because it looked too much like what was then the flag of the United States, and people were getting confused in battle and shooting at the wrong people, the fog of war. So they changed it, and they went through a series of flags, including one which incorporated the battle standard of Northern Virginia in the upper left canton and was otherwise a plain white flag. And the guy who created that, a newspaper editor from the South, I don't remember exactly where he was from, who referred to that as the white man's flag. Because to him, that's who his people were. That was the group of people he found important. They changed it later because if there wasn't a wind blowing, you didn't see the battle standard, you just saw the white, and people sometimes mistook that for a flag of surrender. So they added a red bar along the right edge.
And bringing up this, what you're talking about is the design for what we now all sort of culturally accept as the Confederate flag, which is the red flag with the X on it and the stars going through it. We can see it on the screen. The folks at home can see it on the screen right now. Which actually brings up something in our local tie-in, so thank you for segueing right into that, is we had in January a person who had displayed the Confederate flag on their porch, and a neighbor had complained. They went to the city council and they discussed it. And since then, the person has taken down the flag. Now, and I also want to be a little bit, because this is the ground where I think that we start to lose people when we have this discussion, because fingers get pointed. You did this, therefore you must be bad. But let's talk about that process of the Confederate flag being heaved up, whether it's by a police officer in their garage, whether it's being raised by someone who is attaching sort of this different meaning to it. The youth in question was attaching not the deep tradition of racism associated with that flag, and was sort of detaching from the concept that people nowadays in 2016 and 2015 raised that flag to evoke racism, and it was attaching their own separate meaning to it, which is a meaning of independence and defiance and sort of that sort of thing. So let's talk about that for a little while, because I don't want to be too damning about the one individual citizen who actually took the feedback and responded. But on the one hand, maybe by talking about it, we could avoid those situations entirely in our own community.
Well, when I look at the Confederate flag, right, there's a certain feeling I will have about that flag because of history. One of the things, like any flag, I mean, it usually it's a symbol for that state or for a country. The Confederate flag, at one time, I think it may have been more representative of the Confederate dad and how it was used. However, coming into the 40s in the United States, began to change a little bit. There was one, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was around like Georgia's flag. Georgia's flag never had anything on it from the beginning, but through time it began to change. And in 1956, I think it was, they had a legislative meeting to change it, where the emblem of Georgia's flag became smaller, and then what we see as the Confederate flag was big, made big. And it came to represent something different. They wanted, to the best of my knowledge, I think, wanted it to be looked at as where they wanted things to stay. They wanted segregation to remain. They wanted that aspect of when this thing is shown and flown, it would represent an aspect of intimidation to certain folks, to those who might want to not want to maybe integrate instead of stay segregated. So it was more of an intimidation factor. Things changed. You know, there was this very negative connotation to it. You know, I look at it as very representative of swastika. You know, at one point, swastikas, emblem of good luck. And then when the Nazis took it over, it became a symbol of, the symbol changed, of oppression.
Basically.
Yeah, thank you.
Something I would like to say about the Saltaire flag, the battle standard of Northern Virginia, is after the Civil War, it wasn't used. It wasn't used for more than half a century. It started to be used again in the late 20s, early 30s by the Ku Klux Klan. Mm-hmm. It wasn't part of state flags at that time. It didn't become part of state flags until the 50s and 60s. They started flying the Confederate flag over the Capitol in South Carolina in 1962. And I mention that because it was only late last year after the massacre at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston that the governor of that state took the flag down after a lot of pressure from many people. And there were lots of people standing out there really upset because she was taking down this flag, saying, well, this is a flag of heritage and blah, blah, blah. No, it's not. They didn't even fly that until 1962. This wasn't about some sort of Confederate heritage. This was about a reaction to the civil rights movement. There was no other reason for doing that. And in fact, if you go back to the speeches that were given at the time when the legislature took the vote to fly that flag, they specifically said that. People like to change history in their minds. There are a lot of people that talk about the Confederacy as a matter of being against tariffs and taxes, being about states' rights. 6 of the 11 Confederate states actually pass articles of secession. In all of them, and I have read them all, none of them mention taxes or tariffs, which, by the way, had been set by the southern states anyway, because they largely controlled the legislature in Washington. None of them mention states' rights. Want to know what all of them mentioned? Slavery. The Articles of Secession for Texas mentioned slavery 21 times. I think it's Mississippi that says that not only do they want slavery, but they want to move slavery into all non-slave states and all new territories. That's what it was about. For those of you who wonder specifically, take a look at the cornerstone speech of Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, in which he specifically says that slavery is the natural position of blacks, and that the cause of the Civil War is slavery. And he says that in so many words.
So I think a lot of people that watch this stuff, they listen to figures, they listen to facts, and they think, oh, you know, that was over 200 years ago. 150 years ago. Yeah, 150 years ago, let's move on. Let's forget about the Civil War, let's move on.
Well, you know, the interesting part of that is that the people always say, well, let's forget about slavery, but let's remember the heritage of the antebellum South. You still have the Sons of the Confederacy that hold their Confederate ball every year. You still have people who fly the flag and say it's about heritage. So they're not really saying, let's forget about the Civil War, because we've been refighting that war since the day it ended, pretty much. I remember going to a magazine stand once. There were 5 separate magazines just on the Civil War. So we're not forgetting the war.
And I don't think we really are, because we see that the trending, it shifts and shifts and shifts. And if we were ready as a nation to move on and move forward, we wouldn't be having this discussion, and we wouldn't feel that it was relevant. I know that I've had conversations with each of you singularly, individually, and we've talked about the differences of what it is to grow up black versus what it is to grow up white versus maybe what it is to grow up Asian, which is my experience. How do we paint that portrait for folks at home? How do we, as 3 proactive people, talk about what are racial differences? Because there are racial differences, because we orient ourselves to them. And we talked a little bit, we brushed the surface of white privilege. And white privilege really is all of the stuff that you receive as a white person, the opportunities, cultural, that you are embedded in your own level culturally, what kind of hair place you can go to, all of these things that someone like my father, who is white, takes as granted, are not taken for granted if your skin is not white. And that's sort of what I want to focus on a little bit right now, because we've had a lot of discussion about white privilege. We've had a lot of national discussion about Black Lives Matter. We've heard the counter argument, which is all lives matter, and we'll go into that in a little bit. But I want for each of you to have the opportunity to relay what was different about growing up.
Could I begin?
Yes, please.
One of the differences you see, we talk about white privileges. One of the white privileges is if a police car pulls up next to you on the street, the first thought that comes to your mind isn't, I'm about to be shot. That's privilege. I grew up in the city of Los Angeles, where police would give me a hard time if I was sitting on my front porch, where they would approach me with their hands on their guns. And that's normal police procedure. I understand that. I have a lot of friends who are cops, including, I think, the guy who had the battle standard up in his garage. But it's a difference. I was taught as a boy, when the police approach you, make sure your hands are visible. If you're driving, make sure your hands are on the wheel. Do not remove your hands from the wheel. When they ask for your identification, say to them, I am reaching for my identification now. I'm going to move slowly. If you're a white person, you don't have to do that. And yeah, there are white people who have been hassled by the cops. The difference is they're much, much less likely to get shot. Last year, over 100 unarmed black men and boys were shot by police in the United States. It's not something that you have to worry about as much if you're a white person. In a lot of communities, you don't have to worry about it at all. And, in some cases, the police said that they felt threatened. One of the guys was naked. Where was he going to hide a weapon? His hands were visible, but he got shot anyway. In the case in Chicago from 2 years ago, where the 19-year-old, I think he was 19, was shot in the back 16 times while he was walking away, what was the threat? So that's privilege.
Jan, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I would say that, if you, I'm going to go with George said, that stuff, it rings so true to me, for me, as a man who has experienced being stopped by the police for whatever reason. And the thing is, there are a lot of police officers who I know, who I trust, who I'm friends with. However, I have often through personal experience, that I've had different experiences from police officers that I did not know, starting from the age of 8 years old. Now, I don't think I've ever been a violent person. I don't think I've ever been a person to look for trouble. And I think I usually do things in a pretty reasonable manner. However, that doesn't stop people from stopping me. You know, I mean, the last time I was stopped was approximately 3 years ago. An officer asked me, did I have any roaches in the car? And my
And
wife...
just for the folks at home,
yeah, it
a
was,
roach would be a small piece of a marijuana cigarette
exactly,
left over, correct?
Exactly. And my wife bent over and said, why does he keep asking if we have any insects? And I said, officer, look, I don't smoke this stuff. I said, I don't even drink. He said, why do you keep asking me this question? And he was just pressing me. And my thing is, you feel angry, but you also are trained not to get angry.
Who did
not
that
to
train
show
you?
get angry.
Who trained you?
My parents.
So
my parents,
I guess,
because they looked at it. I mean, my father's from Georgia. No, he came from an experience where he lived in Jim Crow South, and so there was a lot of things he wanted us to understand and to learn. Because the bottom line is, it's harder to stay safe in America when you have darker skin. You're 4.5 times more likely to get the business end of a firearm from a police officer when you have darker skin.
You're also much more likely to get pulled over in the first place.
Bottom line.
Well, it's interesting.
And when you wear, right now I'm dressed down a little bit, but, I've gone places with friends as a kid, gone to stores separate times, thinking I might be dressed nice, but being followed. And those friends who were Caucasian weren't followed. And, wasn't a one-time deal. I'm thinking, I'm not here to steal, but why am I feeling like a criminal? And that was something that, my friends had no clue about. So, that's that aspect of white privilege. Going somewhere and, you looked at like, why are you here? Friends of mine could go to the same place, not have that feeling.
And I think that what was really, I mean, all of your experience is relevant, but what really rings out for me is that that's what your dad taught you. So there was a dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
There was, at some point, because I'm, excuse me, I'm a parent, and at some points in parenting, we have specific dialogues
Mm-hmm.
with our children about what to do and what not to do. And so my kids are of the age that we've had the conversation of appropriate places where your body can be touched and places where it should not be touched.
Mm-hmm.
But it's sort of on that level, someone in a leadership role had that conversation with you. And I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to share sort of what that conversation looked like or sounded like.
Yeah, and it wasn't just my parents, it was also my cousins, and most of my cousins are much older than I am. My father came from a family of 9 children, and his older siblings had children, and they would all say the same thing. This is how you need to behave. Particularly growing up in the late 50s, early 60s, because until 1964, there were certain towns that I couldn't be in after sundown.
Sundown towns.
Yeah, I remember being yelled at for going to the wrong water fountain when we went to visit my grandmother in Oklahoma, because at the time there was still a legal separation. And of course, the water fountain that was available to people like me didn't look quite as good as the water fountain that was available to the majority population. So you have the distinction was greater at that time. We were living in an apartheid society. That didn't exist overtly where I lived in Southern California. It was still there, but it wasn't as overt. There wasn't a de jure separation of groups. There was when we went south. And the laws there, even after 1964, some of those apartheid laws still existed. The anti-miscegenation laws That didn't change until 1967 or 68. And if you look at the progression of that law through time, at first it was just black people couldn't marry white people. But later they made it black people couldn't marry Filipinos specifically, and couldn't marry Indians, and couldn't marry Asians. And then it became you couldn't even have sexual relations with any of these people. And the punishments were really quite severe, assuming that you made it to trial and didn't just get lynched. I remember a year or so ago hearing Donald Trump, the current Republican presidential contender, going on about how he was upset that black people could use the word nigger, but he couldn't. And I'm going, you still can. The difference is that you now can no longer lynch the people who object. And that's really what he's upset about.
And I'm also pretty convinced that he uses that word a lot, just not in front of the cameras. Kinda. That's my feeling, at least. But I'm not there. I'm not gonna. That's not substantiated on any level. Which kind of segues nicely into the Black Lives Matter movement. So I'm a big fan of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I know that there's a big backlash with the Black Lives Matter movement. But one of the things that I find with the backlash is there's this sort of there's this perspective that we should be inclusive, and I don't disagree. We should be inclusive. We shouldn't need Black Lives Matter as a movement because we should be there already, in my humble opinion, but we're not there. So when people counter with things like all lives matter, I had to do some serious thinking about that. I was like, well, yes, of course, all lives matter. But when you say Black Lives Matter, are you saying that other lives don't matter? And then I thought, no, you're not saying that. So why is it so offensive to everybody that there's this Black Lives Matter movement and that black people are standing up to say that Black lives do matter in this wake of huge amounts of violence that have recently been brought to light, with the Confederate flag being raised in the committing of violent crimes against the black population. They're not going into white churches and shooting up white people.
Because we have a history in this country of blacks and other minorities not being human.
Right.
And there are some people who want to keep it that way. Some people simply want to use the All Lives Matter as a way of saying we don't want to recognize that as a problem. We have the blinders on and we see no problem. A wonderful representation of this, I saw somebody drew a cartoon of a burning house next to a house that wasn't burning, and somebody was pouring water on the house that wasn't burning, saying all houses matter. And that's basically what it comes down to. Yes, of course all lives matter. That was never a question. The difference is that while you recognize those other lives mattering, you completely ignore the fact that Black lives matter too.
Right. It also occurs to me that...
Excuse me, before you go on, may I add something to that? You know, one of these things is, as far as all lives matter, Black lives matter, you know, people who may say all lives matter may not have really stopped to think about, you know, some of the stuff you just mentioned, George. You know, the history of this country, where people, I mean, you know, I can think of my Father's Day and my great-grandfather's day, where they came from. They could look at a woman who happened to be white and end up lynched. You know, this could have been
Emmett Till, for example.
Exactly, and the thing is, Emmett Till was one of the big person. I mean, here's was he 13, 14 years old?
Yes.
You know, killed. Here is an adolescent, you know, basically an 8th grade young man, you know, for looking and maybe even whistling at a white woman, right? But here is his crime committed against him, And oftentimes, with the help of the police, and that's the one thing with this. The police have often been involved and complicit to a lot of these crimes have been committed against other people, these shootings. Over the past year, 108, African-American males shot. This has been the history of this country. And this is something that I think a lot of people don't look at. It's something that's still perpetuated. And oftentimes, again, the business end of that firearm, 4.5 times more likely, if you're black, that you will be killed. You will be shot and killed. This is what we're talking about. Not that all lives don't matter. All lives do. But we need to look at really the history of this country and what's happened and what continues to happen. Yeah, sure, we may not see lynchings. I can hear stories of my family talking about taking a walk through the woods and seeing a guy swinging on it from a tree, right? We may not be in those times, but we're not that far away from it. I mean, I'm not sure what your age is. I'm a bit younger than George. I still remember riding on segregated trains. I'm a fairly young man, but I remember these things. I mean, this is not that far away. And you would think, yes, it's 2016. Have we made some advances? Yes, but there's some, we still have a long way to go. And that's why this movement of Black Lives Matter.
It's interesting. The NAACP created a list of lynchings in America from, I think, about 1870 until like 1930 and came up with 5,000. And I was talking about this with somebody who immediately said, well, white people were lynched too. Yeah, of the 5,000, roughly 500 of them were white people, mostly Jewish. And some of those people who were lynched were actually lynched for criminal activities. But sort of like the all lives matter thing, what you're doing is ignoring the 4,500 black people who were lynched so that you can focus on the 500. Because you want to ignore that problem. You want to say, that's not really a problem because look, this other thing also happened. Or the old thing about, my blues are worse than yours. Well, yes, black people had it bad, but my people worked on the railroad and they were treated badly. Yeah, that's a problem. It's not something that you need to compare. Because black people who worked on the railroad, Chinese people who worked on the railroad, Irish who worked on the railroad, they were all treated poorly. That's the problem that needs to be fixed. Instead of us fighting between each other here, let's address the problem of the railroad. Let's address the problem that they were taking taxpayer dollars, basically stealing taxpayer dollars to build this railroad that benefited them.
I want to show this clip, and I think that each time we get together, and sometimes the guests will be different, but each time we get together, we'll show a little clip because there's a whole lot of stuff out there on the YouTube and the internet. It's like the YouTube, like it's an institution, but I tend to have a perspective that is a hopeful perspective. I tend to like to have my blinders on, and I'm challenging myself now by taking the blinders off. Because I am a parent and I have children that have friends that are, multiracial friends, and it makes me happy that their experience is not what my experience was. So in that way, I am always and ever hopeful. On the other hand, it exists, it's out there, we've established it. Let's share it, let's spread it around, let's see what it looks like. And we're going to take a look at this clip, which if you have children watching, you should be warned that this is a graphic clip. It involves language. and it involves a lot of really messed up perspectives. So we're going to take a look. Now, this is two Brazilian filmmakers, like any kids out here today that we stipend and to go cover something, are doing their YouTube show. And this is what happens when one white woman sees two Brazilian dark-skinned people near an airport with a video camera. Let's take a look.
Yeah.
Put it on your face. Put it on his face.
All right, let's see. What's up, guys? So we're over here filming over here, exercising. Look what this lady wants to tell us. Go ahead. Let us know. Go ahead.
I said you're a scumbag.
Uh-huh.
You're child pedophiler.
Uh-huh.
Faggot bitches
Uh-huh.
that turn into terrorists.
Okay.
You each other's asses, suck each other's and rape children, and turn it, and you're terrorists now because you hate yourself so much. Now you're taking pictures in front of a plane to remind you of 9/11. I'm gonna feel stupid taping this, right? Put it on you. Famous.
Holy shit. All right, now let's get her license plate. Hey, you cannot make it up. What the?
We can't make this up. Let me get your license plate.
Look at this guy.
Put your license plate down.
You gonna run me over too?
Oh, you so American that you look like you're not terrorist?
You gonna run us over?
I would never do that.
Oh.
I'm putting y'all on Facebook.
Go ahead. Really feel stupid.
No, I'm really not going to feel stupid because you're not an American top team. You're American terrorists. And God told me so. God is in your brain and your brain.
Hey, look, hold on.
Show everybody who's
How stupid
Show
do you
everybody
feel
who's
talking about God. The hoarder, too. Oh, you're a hoarder. Come on, look at this.
I know they're a little American. You're a hoarder. I'm a fucking Middle Eastern. You're a hoarder watching American television. Watch American television about hoarders. That's American television. That's American television. That's what I'm doing here with you two. In front of the airplane, trying to act like you're so cool with 9/11. You're such his right? You're child pedophiles, right? Well, look at him. Look at him. Look at him, the guy you suck. You, the guy taping it.
So the clip is a lot of swearing.
Yeah.
And actually, it's also heightened by the fact that these guys are so shocked by what she's saying, and it's so irrational and insane, because clearly there's a link. There's a documented link between Afro-Brazilian heritage and homosexuality and terrorism, right? That's a natural link, isn't it? Isn't that a natural link? And
Just yesterday, a woman who was running for a position on the Texas school board said something about the President of the United States, the current President of the United States, having worked as a male prostitute to earn money to buy drugs. And I'm looking at this thing, what planet do you live on and what color is the sky there?
having seen that clip, I was dumbfounded, and I actually thought it was a joke. And George, I have to thank you for emailing me this clip. As soon as I said, we really need to have this discussion, and started recruiting some support from the community to have this discussion, in comes this clip. I don't even know where to begin and what to say about this clip.
Yes, well, I'm not sure what one can say. It's a person who's so completely ignorant of the world that she sees people that she doesn't like, and she doesn't like them because of the color of their skin. And so she just reacts. And so she starts calling them every dirty name she can think of, everything else that she hates. It's just hate speech at its most concentrated.
It really is. It is hate speech at its most concentrated. I didn't show the whole thing. We didn't show the whole thing. But I think you get enough to figure out what's going on here. And there was excuse me.
Right.
Might you be willing to tell me what you're doing with your video cameras? No.
No, it's an aspect of no respect for these young men.
No respect, and it is so. As we go forth into our weeks and our months, or our month between shows, I would like to ask the citizens out in East Hampton to start having this dialogue about what racism means and how it plays itself out. And ask yourself, if you're white, what is my privilege? We're going to end with an image, also sent by Mr. Claxon, of someone who is standing outside. Here it is. And I think that this image tied it up for me nicely, and I absolutely just adore this image because it is so open. This person holding a sign is so open, and that is the thought that I want to leave with East Hampton today. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, will you come back? Will you promise to come back?
Sure.
And we can keep
Absolutely.
keep having this dialogue.
All right.
Great. Okay. If you would like to get in touch with the show or you'd like to register your comments, please visit our website, www.easthamptonmedia.org. Or you can send us an email at info@easthamptonmedia.org. Thank you and good night.